Hello.
Hi,
Hi, hello. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Hello, David.
Hello.
Hello. Nice to see you. What would you say about the shift in thinking over these last couple of months?
Yeah, the I'm not quite sure whether the pandemic will change the tendencies that prevailed before the crisis into more brighter, more meaningful way. But as far as I know, the many of the local governments in South Korea, the leaders, especially many mayors, are trying, and they have shown some kind of leadership with the grassroots people towards a new field of new policies, which has close relationship with the new economic system. For example, new universal currencies, but based on emergency, was adopted very rapidly in many local governments. And a Green New Deal is also brought to the table among the government discussion for the new budgets to cope with the urgent crisis against the strong opposition from the bureaucratic side. So it's a good sign, but I'm worrying as an economist that the crisis will go deeper and will not show any signs of the end. So where is the end of the tunnel? We cannot expect, or we cannot anticipate yet. So on the one side, the big problems in terms of economic circulation has, but on the other side, people or the government are now realizing that we need a new type of approaches, new way of thinking, new type of policies is very needed. So both sides, yeah.
And David, what do you see in America?
Well, it's fascinating the way it is exposing so clearly how poorly the economy works for most people. I think that's coming out in a way that never has before. And in a way, exposing that the people who are least served are also the ones ultimately doing the most essential work. And I think that's very useful. The other thing is, I think similar to what Gunna was saying, this would not be the same because you've got very competent higher level leadership in Korea, but in the United States, we're seeing the grotesque incompetence of the national administration. And the positive leadership is coming from cities and states, almost universally from the local. And I think that's positive. From a global standpoint, I'm also struck that I think countries all around the world that, for a long time kind of looked to the United States for leadership, often inappropriately. But I think now no one in their right mind looks to the United States for real leadership, which is pushing the leadership down toward greater creativity and pushing it away from the neoliberal agenda, which the United States has been promoting around the world for a very long time.
I think it's so interesting, that in every country I know of, the wiser political leadership is trickling upwards, from the local, from the mayors. And it's been like that for a very long time. But I think, for us, the big lesson from that is that as a mayor of a town, or even as a regional governor, you're more likely to see the impact of your policies on people and on the natural world. whereas when you're at the top, you're looking at numbers and those, these abstract concepts or numbers, and still adhering to this mantra that more global free trade is going to enrich your country and create more jobs. So I think that's certainly what we're seeing in other countries as well. And does that give you a certain sense of optimism, David?
Well, certainly within within the limits we're experiencing it. And I think along the lines of what you're saying, we're really shifting to more of a focus on living systems. I mean, on the how do we maintain the functions of nature and do it in ways that we get our supplies of food and water and shelter for people, all the basics. So it does begin to pull it away from a focus on moving money around. On the other hand, at the same time, it's kind of, in one way, it's a relief. Everybody sort of seems to recognize now that, if you got a shortage of money, you just print it. You get lots of money. But somehow there also seems to have been a forgetting that if you do that randomly, you can create enormous inflation very rapidly, and that it's extremely dangerous to do it without a clear understanding of what the money is to be used for, where it is to go, and how much the system can absorb in a useful way.
For me, that fits in very much with understanding that we need to establish that link between genuine wealth and this symbol of wealth, this technology, which is money. And again, that speaks to localizing. And because until we start making that link within more localized systems, we're lost, I believe, because the financialization of nature at the global level is extremely dangerous in the hands of monopolies.
Very. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I tend to stress is, it's just remembering that ultimately we're living beings and our well-being depends on Earth's well-being, and that's absolutely foundational. And if when we get into understanding how life organizes, life always organizes from the bottom up. At least everything I can see in it and understand as our understanding of biology and living systems deepens. That's the way life organizes, and it's exactly the opposite of the way that humans have been tending to organize for roughly the last 5,000 years. So we're getting back to basics.
Yeah. Although, I guess I see this escalation whereby humans started organizing themselves differently, particularly with urbanization, where they alienated themselves from nature. But there's been this progression that we call progress and civilization. And I think that's what we have to question fundamentally now as we move further and further and further away and into our financial towers, as symbols of this great wealth and success. I think we have to see that as a wrong turn, don't you? We've just got too far removed from the natural world, and this is, for me, I like to talk about it as having created an inhuman system, and that we should be gaining some hope and some inspiration from the multitude of grassroots initiatives that are demonstrating human goodwill, human desire for community, human concern about the plants and the animals. I mean, look at the number of movements where people are expressing that desire. So I feel as a new economist or localist, I'm feeling a certain sense of hope I think my friends who have been struggling to protect the environment, many of them are feeling deeply depressed, and they're essentially feeling completely negative about human nature. You know, they're blaming the human race. They're saying things like, we are just, you know, a cancer on the earth. We deserve to extinguish ourselves. And I don't see it that way. I think we got lost in this inhuman system and got trapped in it. And actually, it's not representative of human nature. Would you agree with that, both of you?
Yeah, go ahead, Gunna.
Yeah, I totally agree with that type of perspective, and I'm practically focusing on the current situation where I am, which means I'm living, or many of South Korean people are living in the mega cities, urban life environments. So almost 80% of the population live in urban areas. So how can we move towards the local and very friendly with the natural environments like before? So how nowadays, the good thing is that one of the keywords is transformation or transition. So the direction is almost clear towards the more ecological way of life. So the problem or the task is how to set a strategy, how to set or distribute the policies under that strategy more tangible, more realistic. So we need to, as I agree with Helena, that we need to scale down the policy. We need to distribute the resources to the more smaller sized cities or local governments from the mega cities. That is what I'm doing or what I'm suggesting. So resilience and self-sufficiency and changing the relationship with urban rural areas is what now the big cities are trying to do towards the local kind of economy. So instead of the former policies mainly set some areas and then send some big industries in terms of chemical, digital, this is the communication, like this type of distribution policy is the only policy that the megacities has been done before so far. But now the big governments are realized that we need to set every single small areas, make it more resilient, more self-sufficient. So which is the key concept of scale down of the policy resources and then make so many different type of local economy make it kind of ecosystems in itself. So that is very important part. And then the Green New Deal, the South Korean type of Green New Deal should make that happen in that ways, and it should contribute towards that direction. So that is what we are discussing with the civic groups or local governments together.
I think also if we understand that those big cities were getting their food from the other side of the world and not just getting it from there, but, you know, food flying around the entire globe before it reached the city, and now it's trying to reestablish those shorter distances, you know, it's pretty clear, and diversify and revitalize genuinely healthy agriculture.
Yeah, one thing I was deeply moved is that from the Green Deal from the EU, that from farm to fork kinds of the circulation economy in terms of the agricultural sector, it was very impressive. So I'm strongly supporting that type of approach and suggesting how can we make the economy not linear, but make it kind of circulation from production to the waste. We need to make it a kind of connected together, and we need to be very responsible every single stages of circulation of economy.
Yeah, and that, I mean, David, would you agree with me that we need to distinguish between a circular economy in terms of a place, in terms of a city or a country, versus the circular economy that a lot of big business are claiming to establish?
Yeah, I don't know what the big businesses claim to be establishing as a circular economy. Certainly, the situation has focused attention on the supply chains, and again, when you come down to living systems, they are by nature self-reliant in terms of material resources, nutrients and water, continuously recycling. And I think this is one of the things that we figured out years ago, Helena, in the International Forum on Globalization, that local economies should be relatively self-reliant in material resources, partly because of this essential recycling of nature. On the other hand, we should be freely sharing ideas and information and beneficial technology, which is just exactly the opposite of what the neoliberal global economy is designed to do. Now, another piece of this, which I think it's not getting enough discussion, but it is certainly very much at the heart of what's happening, is within these urban centers, the move towards single person housing. And the statistics are quite stark on this, and particularly in regard to South Korea, the United States, Japan, I believe China, that upwards around a third of people live in single person households. Now, if you think about that in terms of the kind of economy, I don't know whether you've how much this is true in South Korea, but in the United States, so many people depend on these low-paid jobs and a bit of work over here and a bit of work over there. So they live alone in a household, and then they get in a car or mass transit or whatever. They're moving around all day between jobs, where they have no real deep ongoing connection with either human or natural communities. And it's absolutely devastating in terms of both mental and physical health. Now, the thing that's so fascinating in my experience here on Bainbridge Island, and I think it's fairly common locally around the United States, my experience is rather atypical because most of my attention is at my desk, and I'm focused on international global colleagues like you two. But my wife, Fran, has gotten really focused on the local, and she spends her time, communicating with Zoom, but with local, the local city council and local transportation groups. And in fact, the discussions and the intensity of community interaction is, I think, a lot stronger than it has typically been. And that's a fascinating positive development. And whether it's actually going to get into recognizing, longer term recognition that, it's destructive in so many ways to be living in individual households. We need families, we need communities, we need to, be organized in a totally different way. Somehow that needs to come into the conversation.
I think absolutely, David. You probably wouldn't remember, but when I started all this work back in the 70s, I was coming back from Ladakh, and one of the big messages was that. And that was in the 70s. I found out that half of all the dwellings in Stockholm were inhabited by one person living alone. So this was the sort of the mirror I was trying to hold up, because in Sweden also there was quite a lot of alcoholism, depression. And so for me, this is a fundamental part of why localizing is probably, this is of course why I call it the economics of happiness also, because it is the economics of reconnection locally. It's about building those more stable long-term relationships that we need to thrive. And it's particularly, traditionally, even when we lived in Spain in the 80s, there was still much more intergenerational connection too, between the youngest and the oldest. You'd even have in the disco in the village, the 100-year-old granny and the newborn baby, and everyone singing together and so on, even in Spain in the 80s. And that was before this global consumer culture really got so much support and such energy to impose itself worldwide with images of this teenage boy urban culture. And so I think too, the epidemics of depression, the epidemics of anxiety among young people are so linked to that lack of deep community and connection, and then being thrust into this system where you're supposed to be globally famous, globally relevant, globally wealthy. I mean, it's an impossibility for 99.9% of the human race. So that's also what I mean by an inhuman economic system, that's destroying humanity as well as the rest of life. So to me, decentralizing and localizing is absolutely essential.
I think there's another dimension of this, though, Helena, that is lost in just localization. And the thing that's lost is the sense of community. I mean, it's implied, but it needs to be absolutely explicit, because we can be localized and separated, but it's just assumed in our thinking that when we're talking about localization, we are talking about community. And that may be sort of intuitive to those of us who come out of that earlier experience. Like, where I grew up, and I was in a small town, and all the aunts and uncles and cousins and the babies and the grandparents, we all lived in the same place, and we gathered all the holidays, and we were a family. There's no two members of my family currently, unless they're married, who are living in the same place.
Yeah, one of the big challenges is that demographically, demographically, the single family is more than 20% in Korea, and it will grow faster. And the other thing is that the untaxed kind of digital-based platform workers, mostly they are young generations, more and more they are also they are forgotten categories of people even at the local level. The young generations move around the cities. They are not get connected with the localized history of the families or hometowns. So even though we are focusing on the economic system of the local level, more sufficient or more resilient, that cannot cover enough about the platform type of workers and young generations and digital type of shared economy. So how to get this type of workers of living systems, economic systems of way of life into real face-to-face based local community level is a kind of big challenge.
Actually had not thought of before, but is really foundational. That so many of our young workers are in the technology, and especially the technology of the web. Mm-hmm. And that at one level is extremely important to our ability to function as a global species, but it also absolutely disconnects them from the physical local economy that is essential to life. And I'd never quite thought before about that aspect of the new tech workers, but it's foundational, very important.
I think it's absolutely foundational, and to me, part of the new economy direction and why I'm stressing local is that when we talk about foundational, we've got to talk about the natural world as being the absolute foundation and home and only economy that we have.
Humans
So
cannot live by the web alone.
Sorry?
Humans cannot live by the web alone.
And we cannot eat computer chips, you know? And so, as far as I'm concerned, part of the shift towards the local is to diminish our dependence on the web. And I would argue that I think we're going to wake up to, I'm hoping very soon, to the need to use the web for communication, but not for business. That, see, partly this is as we look at local, what we're talking about is actually creating those place-based, human scale, interrelated structures. So that is a way of building community. And that happens when you know Joe, who's been running that cafe or that pizzeria down the street, and when that is a stable entity that's been there for years and you know each other, you start building relationships that also become a type of structural insurance for ethical behavior. You start building a type of human interdependence that is how we evolved. And I would argue that just as we have to come back to the foundational truth of nature, we have to come back to the foundational truth of who we are as human beings, and we need to feel those connections. So, you know, no doubt we need now to rely on the internet and the satellites and every technology we have virtually to monitor for climate emergencies, for aid and support in times of crisis, and for collaboration, you know, from civic society to governments, absolutely vital and essential now. But I think we should be really, really clear about trying to reduce our dependence on the web for providing for our needs. And let's start also looking at what are our needs. And let's look at the degree to which the internet economy is not about providing for needs, but in many ways destroying our most fundamental needs.
The poor people, they are more and more dependent on the digital devices in their hands to deliver the food, to deliver stuffs, and to take the chance of short time work with their calling from the people around. So we call it the platform workers, and that is far below the national safety net. So how can we deal with that forgotten workers into the surface of social safety is a kind of national agenda, and kind of the polarization of the wealth and income is based by the technology is one of the big challenge that the local approach should handle or should deal with. And the other thing is that how can we make the new relationship with the urban and local is not that clear, and especially young generation has almost never experienced the beauty or the deep emotional sense of nature after they was born. So they are not that interested in that type of things, and they were not taught at school about that type of subjects. So how can you change the education based on the new relation with urban and rural, or new economy and new environment, new planetary boundaries? So that is another issues. How can you think about the education for the next generations?
Part of the education of the young should be engagement in the rural. I mean, the young urban people need to learn about the rural areas. Maybe go back to what we used to do, where the young folks used to go out and do agriculture labor in the summer during the school vacation, and get attached to the land. It needs to be part of our basic conceptual framing. and then the integration of the communications technology locally and globally, but as a support, not a substitute for the physical relationships. Mainly, the mainly local physical relationships, with a whole lot less global movement of people and goods. Much more of the global movement can be electronic.
You see, also what's so, I think, important to try to tell people is that if economies were more localized and stable, for one thing, we'd be talking about much greater adaptation to a diversity of climates, cultures, ways of doing things, languages. Traveling in order to learn and to see another culture and to learn from them, to learn another language, the richness of life would be restored. And having stable local economies isn't some kind of prison. There wouldn't be a reason why individuals couldn't travel in order to experience something other. And of course, we're not talking about, or I don't mean a mass tourism where you fly across the world for a few days and to just look at things from the outside, but the genuine wealth that would come from really more deeply experiencing something other. So I think, again, we've got the complete, we've got this reverse now where environmentalists feel they shouldn't travel at all, but in the meanwhile, the travel of those promoting consumerism and the travel of goods that's completely unnecessary is escalating. But I think, Gunna, I was going to say, you're saying, how can we change things? You introduced me to that wonderful superintendent of education in Seoul, who's already making steps to have students engaged with food and farming and committing to sourcing food from local farms. And there's Sungmi-san in Seoul, which is this community of now about 20,000 people, where they are actually making that link to the rural. They actually have an alternative school, and now, those children in that school have already been also out on the farm as part of their education, and now some of them are actually moving out too, which I think is a wonderful trend. We need that slow trend out of the city to revitalize and rebuild smaller towns and smaller cities instead of this massive push into the mega cities.
It's so obvious in a way that when we get on an airplane to go to the other side of the world, it should be for a long visit and a deep immersion into the culture and understanding that particular part of the world and developing longer term relationships. Right. I mean, I remember years ago, one of the most absurd experiences in my life was when I was living in New York City. And somehow some folks in the Ford Foundation decided that I needed to be at a meeting in Manila. It was about 2 hours long. And I flew all the way from New York City to Manila for that damn meeting. I'm finding, like in my experience with the Club of Rome, which is very international, that it's been characteristic. The Club of Rome only organizes their meetings as physical get-togethers. And the time is usually spent with us lecturing to each other. And now we're having our meetings by Zoom, and we're actually having conversations.
How interesting.
It's fascinating, yeah. The whole interaction is very different and goes far deeper.
Wow. That's really interesting, because I've heard that also from a lot of families and so on, that in COVID, that's what's happened also to their communication via Zoom and Skype and so on, that they're having deeper connections. That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, I think compared to those meetings, I can see it, but obviously I think for real connection and real health, especially for children, the face-to-face is vital. And, there are so many other dimensions, even that we only beginning to understand how we do communicate face to face. And
Yeah.
that also, to me, that leads me, David, to say how much I value your work for having, as a, white American male economist, all those words that, as some people would say, are reasons to hate you, that you have embraced the spiritual and that you've been communicating, across the whole spectrum from that, tower of establishment, patriarchy, to the deepest, greenest, spiritual dimension. And I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit and how you see the response. I mean, especially from your sort of economist counterparts.
Well, it's interesting that you called me an economist and I sat here and laughed. I used to consider that an insult if somebody called me an economist. Absolutely not. I am not an economist. An economist is someone that doesn't understand money, doesn't understand institutions, doesn't understand power. Those are all things fundamental to. But I've been coming to realize that creating a new economics is absolutely foundational to moving ahead. If you think about economics as the kind of discipline or the intellectual framework that guides us in managing the household. And of course, now the household is a global household of people and nature and all people and the whole earth. And our future absolutely depends on an economics that recognizes that, which of course, the thing that we call economics now does not recognize at all. Just actively denies, including the denial of the existence of community. So I have suddenly redefined myself. Yes, I am an economist, but I'm not one of those economists.
Maybe we could call you an anti-economist. Or economist. People like to use that language now.
Well, I kind of like Kate Raworth's approach to it. She distinguishes between a 20th century economist and a 21st century economist, and I think there's a lot to that because it's a whole thing that's been happening in terms of science, of moving from a purely mechanistic kind of worldview to a living, organic worldview. And that's basically happened during the shift between the centuries. And, that then provides the foundation for a totally different approach to economics, and recognizing by its very nature, it needs to be interdisciplinary. It needs to draw from the whole of human knowledge and understanding, which includes the material, but the material including quantum physics and the spiritual, along with all our institutional knowledge. So in a way, it needs to be the most interdisciplinary of all our fields, which is exact contradiction to the current, the economics that doesn't want to look at any other discipline and considers itself whole and complete in itself. But we've got to shatter that and totally redefine what we mean by economics.
I often say to young people who are interested in our work, I say, whatever you do, don't study economics. We are gathering people who are looking at the economic system, not from within it with these false assumptions about human nature, basically about everything. So
it's an invitation to brain damage to take an economics course, at least a conventional one.
Yeah, and like Kenneth Boulding, wasn't it, who said, anyone who believes in
economy or mad.
Yeah, you're either, anyone who believes, anyone who believes in infinite growth is either an economist or a madman.
Yeah, exactly. It is so true. But I think I hope we are ready to move beyond that. Absolutely essential to our
Yeah.
survival as a species.
Next week, I'm going to make a lecture to the all high level officials of city governments of Seoul, city of Seoul. And my material for the lecture, kind of presentation file, is composed of totally different type of economics and economic knowledge and economists. And definitely you too, and Kenneth Boulding and Schumacher and late Kayworth and Gal Alperovitz and many of the alternative thinkers, but it goes into the John Stuart Mill or even Adam Smith. They said very differently when we look into deeper about the economy. And even Charles Darwin said the economy of nature. And economy and ecology has the same roots of the origin in terms of, so ecology was just developed. The term of ecology was based on the economy of nature, as far as I remember. So I'm going to focus on the different side of the economy and economic thinking from the classical thinkers. But the thing is that the mayors and the high level kinds of the chief of urban planners in city of Seoul, they never heard about that type of economy and economic policy. So it's very influential. It should be very foundational that they need to change the policy or their perspective. So the priority for me, I've learned from the Whiteheadian idea, is that the philosophy and policy should get connected. So one of the conference I was so deeply moved with the farmers and philosophers. Sometimes we can the farmers are very unknowledgeable, but that's not the case. So farmers and philosophers, we can connect two different, just a very natural work and thinking. Deep thinking should two sides of human nature, as far as I understand. So we need to recover that type of economic ideas together.
Did you actually have a conference in Korea with farmers and philosophers?
Oh, no, in the United States, but I attended twice while I was in Claremont. Wes Jackson and Wendell Berry, I was deeply
Oh, wonderful.
I love your reference to the farmers. It reminds me that when I was working, in Asia, on supposedly economic development, I was realizing that the harms of this conventional economics. And as I was deepening my own understanding, I suddenly awakened to realize that most of the farmers in the rural areas, they understood what I was just beginning to figure out.
Yeah, you're right.
They understood it very well. Now, I've got a little meme that I've come up with that you might find useful in that discussion. And it is about our current transition from an economics, a con job economics, to economics, an ecology economics.
How about we-economy?
We-economy? Well, that's another. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly the term well-being economy and well-being economics, I think works very nicely as a very simple language.
Very good too, because we're talking about ecological as well as human well-being,
Yes.
And so that's really about economics of happiness. That's what we mean too, exactly that.
Exactly.
Yeah. But can you say a little bit more about that, about the farmers, and understanding what you were beginning to understand? What else happened? Because I realized that those years in Southeast Asia really opened you to the fact that corporations rule the world. Mm-hmm. And so you had that perspective.
Yeah. It has to do with money. But what I realized is that, economists, with their focus on economic growth, if you're a subsistence farmer and you're growing the food for your family and community, but it is not, your food is not sold through the market so that there is an intermediary price and market exchange, it contributes nothing to GDP. But if your farmland is turned over to some global corporation to grow food for export, and you are moved into a job as an itinerant agricultural worker or a sweatshop factory laborer or whatever, separated from your family and community, then you are contributing to GDP. And so the process was one of getting people out of their self-reliance and their own control of their livelihoods into dependence on the market economy, which then shifts the power to the people who control the creation and allocation of money. And then you put that together with the fact that money is absolutely nothing but a number. And if if you're a central bank, all you got to do is get out your computer and you can have as much money as you want. It is just a number, but it's all part of this whole shift in our entire human orientation, from controlling our means of living to controlling the creation and distribution of money. And it was what I realized over time was it was a process of reestablishing the dynamics of colonialism, but in a basically invisible way.
Yeah, enslavement through debt instead of direct enslavement.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that was my my fundamental insight about what we call economic development and why it was destroying people and nature all around the world. The more economic development we had, the greater the destruction.
No, that's a pretty strong statement. The more economic development we had, the more destruction. And that also for me, now I think partly why we're organizing this event on the web and trying to raise awareness is because so many good people don't realize that. And very often, particularly when they're supporting a sort of so-called third world project and thinking they're doing good, they don't realize that they're actually contributing to destroying self-reliance and also self-respect. There's a psychological dimension. And so there's so much actually goodwill that ends up on the side of destruction without realizing it.
Yeah. Well, your work on Ladakh was so foundational. I mean, that's so helped bring this all together for me. And essentially blasting this whole idea that somehow the more we consume, the happier we are. And what you demonstrated so clearly was, here are people that consume very little, but they're just lovely, warm, happy, deep culture, wonderful relationships. Wow, how could I have more of that?
Yeah. So do you think, what do you think we can do? What is what's the tactic, what's the strategy now to try to change things? I mean, do you agree that one of the biggest problems is that most people don't have access to this information? I feel that most young economists today have never heard of Schumacher, and they may never have heard of you, David. And on the other hand, they get to hear their prime minister talking about how growing the economy is going to help them. Yeah. Don't worry about the trees, we're going to grow the economy and give you a job. And it's a lie, but the lie is often made by people who don't understand that they're lying.
Well, I find my hope in the fact that the truths that we have to embrace are so obvious. And when I speak to groups and make the radical statement that we humans are living beings born of and nurtured by a living earth. Wow, I mean that's really radical. Nobody disputes it, Can you believe that? I mean, people get this esoteric very quickly. I think that's the hope. And I think also, you know, your work, Helena, demonstrates this so dramatically, but it's the same thing in terms of getting people to reflect back on what are the sources of their real happiness. And, you know, the happiness we get from consumption tends to be very brief and fleeting. But our deepest satisfactions tend to come from when we feel we have been of service to a neighbor or a stranger, or you know, you just feel, wow, wasn't that neat? I was useful. So it's, you know, it's getting back in touch, and of course, when you get people into a life where they're just frantically running around trying to get a few dollars or a few pesos so they'll be able to have dinner tonight or feed their children, then we get distracted from what is so obvious. It's so insidious.
Maybe, don't you think it's more serious than that? I mean, what I worry about is, as people's livelihoods are made more and more insecure, and as we're running after technology faster and faster, people running faster and faster, and so fearful of not being able to pay the rent or the mortgage, then it fuels the vote for the demagogue who promises those jobs and growing the economy at any cost, you know, for you. So I think we're in a very dangerous situation that way.
Well, that's where hopefully the coronavirus will kind of help us see things in a new way.
Yeah.
But it's a tremendous challenge. It's why things like this webinar are so important, to get these ideas out. So we have this conversation, and we have this awakening in the process of this crisis and its disruption.
Fortunately, I could find many wonderful elements in every sides of civic sectors, or even in the government sectors. And now I am having a series of lectures for the Catholic sisters and for the NGOs, grassroots activists. So I'm going out of my university and campus, not just teaching students, but I'm trying to spread the ideas to the more ordinary people, or more kind of the middle-level leaders who can stick to their job. When they have any idea in their mind, they are going to devote themselves for the rest of their lives. So yeah, for me, my role, I just myself confess that this is my role, is that I need to bring the philosophy and theory and policy and education and program as a whole. I need to connect these elements into one, and then make it a big picture. It's a kind of ecological civilization, or totally different civilization, toward more meaningful and more progressive and more inclusive. So, but the many of our agendas are not just covered or handled by the local level or local governments. So we need to change the national government or the universal or global systems together. But you give me a kind of hope and strength that we can get connected and make a voice bigger and louder and global. We can make global different alternative voices, and then we can bring these messages to the local level. So that is what I'm eager to do with you and with the mayors and with the local level activists, or even the cities. So 4 categories. One is the urban regenerations. It's not just focused on the buildings or houses or transportations, but people. This is one side. And the next one is how to make the the new type of economic circulation. It's a circulation, but local circulation economy is very important in terms of the income, wealth, and the resources. Natural resources also should be reused, regenerated, repaired, refurbished. And then third one is how to educate, how to make a generational coalition under the name of the ecological perspective. That is very important. So I am going to work with the superintendents how to make the school connected with the local communities. How can we invite the parents to the class or to the public platforms, to not just focusing on their own children, but their own community, their society. So, and then the last one is how can I introduce the ecological economy into the economic curriculum at the university level? So we have many things to do, but I'm very happy with that.
I love particularly, Gunna, that you're taking it outside of the university, and I hope you can persuade other caring academics to do the same. Mm-hmm. Because again, as you say, we need the big picture, we need the holistic, bigger picture. This is what I call big picture activism. That's so vitally needed because, you know, almost everyone is thinking in silos and over-specialized. And of course, especially as David was saying, economics is completely silo thinking, but it's true in most disciplines. And ordinary people, just like you found, David, with those farmers, can often understand much better because they haven't been so brainwashed into narrow disciplines based purely on concepts and numbers, almost not at all on experience. So this is also about reinstating the importance of more experiential knowledge, which is by its very nature more holistic. Yeah, so I love that. And I know how hard you're working. I mean, I don't know if you know, David, how hard people work in South Korea and Japan.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a week's holiday is, you know, is normal. And even some people have told me they're afraid to take that because they're afraid of their job security. This is the madness of this insane, unnatural, inhuman economy, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I love your, you know, getting very clear on the siloed nature of Western academia. But this discussion also brings to mind, you know, my own education and coming to understand the world's cultures. And my recognition, you know, Fran and I moved to Asia in 1978. We moved to the Philippines. And as I look back, I realized there was a point in time when I began to recognize the depth of the difference. You know, at the time I might have thought of as the difference between the Eastern and the Western mind. I now recognize it more as just a cultural difference that, you know, in terms of all the different world's peoples that I've met, I don't see any kind of inherent natural difference in terms of our major humanity, but incredible difference in the cultures. And the thing that I began to recognize in Asia is that in Western culture, I identify as me, I. And in the Asian culture, the primary identification is with the group or the community.
The we, yeah.
And it is that, you know, in a sense, in the advanced, you know, in the new civilization, I think it's getting those in balance. We have to recognize me, but not just my rights, but also my responsibilities to the community.